A bank manager refused to cash a check for a black client, publicly humiliating her while implying doubts about the legitimacy of her funds. What he failed to realize: she wasn't just any client, she owned the bank. What unfolded next would leave even the most seasoned observers in complete disbelief. But before we get to that shocking moment, let's rewind and start from the very beginning. The morning sun cast its golden light over the grand white-pillared structure of the downtown bank, signaling another routine day for Richard Calloway, the branch manager. He adjusted his tie, savoring the prestige that came with his role. In his mind, he wasn't just an employee. He was a gatekeeper, someone who ensured the financial elite of the city were properly served while maintaining a certain standard at his branch. Then she walked in. From the moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. She carried herself with undeniable confidence, her tall frame poised with authority. A tailored business suit hugged her form, and in her grip was a leather briefcase that practically screamed wealth and influence. As she strode across the marble floor, heads turned. Clients, tellers, and even security all took notice. She approached the counter with the kind of composure that comes from knowing exactly who you are. "Good morning," she said evenly, handing over a check. "I'd like to deposit this into my account." The young cashier, Eliza, took one look at the check and her breath hitched. The figure on it was staggering, definitely not something she processed every day. She hesitated only for a second before catching herself. "Ma'am, this is a substantial amount," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "For transactions of this size, we'll need you to speak with the branch manager." The woman didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her face unreadable, and made her way toward the manager's office. Inside, Richard Calloway was reviewing paperwork when Eliza entered. "Sir," she said cautiously, "there's a client here with a very large check. She's waiting outside your office." Richard barely looked up. But when he did, his expression shifted the moment he saw the woman standing at his door. His years in the industry told him that certain types of people usually came in with large checks, and in his mind she didn't fit the mold. He masked his skepticism behind a forced, professional demeanor. "How can I help you?" he asked flatly, barely acknowledging her presence. Unfazed, the woman stepped forward and placed the check on his desk. "I'd like to deposit this into my account," she repeated with calm certainty. Richard picked up the check, scrutinizing it as if it were forged. His lips pressed together. "This is a rather large sum," he muttered, his voice laced with something that wasn't quite concern, it was doubt. "I'll need to verify the source of these funds." "Standard procedure." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "All the necessary documentation is included. You'll find the contact information for my legal firm as well. They can confirm the transaction." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, still gripping the check. "Even so," he said stiffly, "I'll need to delay this deposit for further verification. Perhaps you could provide additional proof of your business's legitimacy." A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. But her voice remained steady. "My business is fully compliant with every banking regulation. You have everything you need to process this transaction." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I decide how and when transactions get processed here," he said, his voice rising slightly. The statement wasn't just about protocol, it was about control. By now, the office had fallen into an uneasy silence. A few employees, sensing the tension, subtly peeked toward the manager's door. Eliza, unable to remain quiet any longer, took a careful step forward. "Sir," she interjected, her voice cautious but firm, "I've seen this client before. She's conducted large transactions with us multiple times. Her name is in our records." Richard shot her a glare that could freeze water. "Eliza, you're dismissed." Then, turning back to the client, he added coldly, "If you have an issue, you're welcome to file a complaint. But I have the authority to investigate any check that seems suspicious." The woman exhaled through her nose, visibly restraining herself. Then, with the same composed tone, she said, "Very well. I'll need to contact the bank's leadership. I believe they'll be interested in how you're handling this investigation. Richard barely had time to process her words before she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Yes, she said into the receiver, her voice controlled but firm. Please connect me to the leadership team. It's urgent. I'm having difficulty processing a check at one of your branches. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he quickly masked it with feigned authority. Whoever you're calling, he scoffed, they'll tell you the same thing. Verification is mandatory. Before he could say another word, the office door swung open. A sharply dressed woman stepped inside, her expression unreadable, but the intensity in her eyes was impossible to miss. It was Jean Ellis, the bank's regional director. Mr. Calloway, she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Would you like to explain to me why one of our most valued clients is experiencing difficulties at your branch? Richard's throat tightened. Jean, I was just performing standard verification on a large transaction, he stammered. Jean's sharp gaze shifted to the client, then back to Richard. Miss Brooks, she said, her tone instantly softening. I deeply apologize for any inconvenience. Is there an issue? Miss Brooks, now fully in control of the situation, held Richard's gaze for a long moment before speaking. Apparently, Mr. Calloway believes my check warrants special scrutiny. And from what I gather, it's not the amount that concerns him. Jean inhaled slowly, her expression hardening. Richard, she said coolly, do you even know who you're speaking to? The room fell silent. Miss Brooks wasn't just a high-profile client. She wasn't just someone with money. She owned the bank. And now Richard Calloway's career was hanging by a thread. Jean turned to Miss Brooks. Your transaction will be processed immediately. I assure you this will not happen again. Miss Brooks nodded, collected her briefcase, and exited the office. But as she passed Richard, she gave him one final look, a look that made it clear this wasn't over. As the door closed behind her, Jean turned back to Richard, her expression like stone. You just made a very serious mistake, she said sharply. And trust me, there will be consequences.